On April 22 of 1970, 20 million Americans, at the time 10% of the total population of the United States, took to the street to demand a healthy and sustainable environment in a massive coast-to-coast rallies. Thousands of colleges and universities organized demonstrations to support our planet and demand action. The first Earth Day demonstration was born 50 years ago and remains the largest civic engagement event in human history. That event forced Congress to take action, and most of our environmental laws were passed with bipartisan support. Among them, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and the Endangered Species Act. Also, this demonstration led to the creation of the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. And it is truly my honor to talk to the students that organized the first Earth Day 50 years ago and created this powerful movement. So please welcome Denise Hayes, Barbara, Alexander, and Stephen Huff. Thank you all for being here with us, and thank you for your wonderful contributions to our planet.
Thank you, Vanessa. They were real students. They went to Harvard and Michigan. I was a dropout, so just want to set the record straight.
Well, thank you. Thank you for being with us. And I would like to start with you, Barbara. Could you take us to 50 years ago? Could we just rewind and go to 50 years ago? What was happening at the time, and what led to these demonstrations?
Well, part of what was going on at the time was a period of great unrest by college students and many Americans to protest the Vietnam War. And there was also a growing sense of unease and upsettedness with what was very visibly, obviously, as significant pollution of our air and water. Events such as oil spills on the beaches in California, haze and smog in Los Angeles, the actual river flowing through Cleveland caught fire as a result of pollution and toxic chemicals in the water. So a growing number of Americans were concerned, and Senator Gaylord Nelson of Wisconsin decided that it would be a good idea to focus attention on this. And his way of suggesting how that would happen was to use the teach-in methodology that the Vietnam War had initiated several years ago. So he thought and helped raise money and helped organize an office headed by Dennis. And the rest of us flowed in from various episodes and locations and experiences, and helped generate a lot of activities for Earth Day 1970.
Well, that was a monumental task, Dennis. Could you tell us, how was the process of organizing so many people together on the same day and following the same cause?
Well, of course, in 1970, we not only didn't have social media, we didn't have cellular telephones, we didn't have computers, we didn't have the internet. It was comparatively difficult. We managed to develop a methodology of placing something that was broadcast. We would get covered by magazines, by newspapers, by television shows, and remarkably, a number of reporters were willing to, and editors were willing to permit them putting our address and our telephone number at the bottom of the story. So these broadcasts would go out to broad swaths of the population, and those who were interested in what we were trying to do would write back to us. We would then, with a very primitive technology, type their names and addresses into addressograph cards that could be spun through a machine and would address envelopes when they're hand cranked, and then we would bring in a bunch of volunteers, fill up 50,000 envelopes full of newsletters, and send them out, and slowly built from a very small base up to about 50,000 activists who were actually committing to do things across the country.
Wow, that's amazing. That was such a different time than the one that we're going through now. Stephen, how long did it take to organize all these people and to make it together to create this huge environmental movement?
Well, I'd say Denny is in a better position to answer that, but I'd say that it was about a 5 or 6 month intense period when the publicity first started and the incoming organizers started to find us. And we would find an organizer in Indianapolis who would then introduce us to 4 or 5 others who were connected with one or another of the aligned organizations or movements. And we had one of our folks, I think it would be, I'd point to Sam Love and maybe Arturo Sandoval, who spent their almost full time trying to work with local community organizations, because that 20 million figure represents more of their work than realistically what we as a couple of dozen people could accomplish.
Wow. Well, you guys were the first environmentalists that we have, and I salute you for that. Barbara, why was it important for you to be part of this?
Well, my personal background was that after graduating from the University of Michigan in 1968, I went to work for the Robert F. Kennedy campaign. And I knocked on doors in Indiana, Portland, Oregon, and San Francisco, California. And after he was assassinated, it became my passion to further the agenda of social justice and politics and public policy. My background was designed to put me over at the State Department. I was going to be a Foreign Service officer, but I dropped that and became very involved in the Earth Day campaign as a result of working for a wonderful woman at the Conservation Foundation in Washington, which, by the way, gave us the first seed money for Earth Day's organizational work, and to help provide what was then even a pittance of a salary for those of us who were working day and night to do this. But I want to emphasize the importance of the fact that we were the repository of what I would call a tsunami of interest that floated up to us. We hardly had to organize anything. We did do some work, of course, to help large urban areas coordinate their local events. But honestly, the grassroots desire to do something about this issue was almost more than we could even keep track of. The phones were ringing day and night. We got postcards from kids, from high schools, from garden clubs, from the League of Women Voters, from the local lung association, you name it, people wanted to do something. It was an obvious result that I don't think anyone could have organized from the top down. It was a bottoms-up event. For sure.
It sounds phenomenal, and I wish I could have been there to feel the excitement at that day. Dennis, so what did you felt when you were there and then you saw this huge amount of people rallying and chanting together and demanding action for the protection of our planet? What was the feeling that was going on the air?
Let me address that right after a quick comment about Barbara, who was, I think, correct, but perhaps a little bit too modest on her own behalf.
I think so too.
Of those people who contacted us, particularly in major cities, overwhelmingly they were women between the ages of 25 and 35, typically college educated, typically with 1 or 2 small children, typically in a single wage earner family, and typically never having been involved in anything political or organizational before in their lives. Many of them proved to have enormous talent. But in the major cities, it was very important for us to send in our regional organizers to make sure that we pulled together a good coalition, that the best of the organizers made it to the top. In a couple of places, we had to stage coups d'etats when the wrong people were sort of picking it up and steering it in bad directions. And Barbara, as our Midwest coordinator, was just enormously invaluable in that. Though to answer your question, I'll tell you the most dramatic moment, certainly of the day for me. The mayor of New York City, John Lindsay, decided that the environment was going to be one of his issues to catapult him into a leadership role in the fight for the control of the Republican Party. He was progressive. Nixon's Southern strategy had made the party increasingly conservative, and Lindsay decided he really wanted to be a player on this. And by player, he shut down Fifth Avenue in New York, blocked off all of the intersections for more than 50 blocks, and filled it. Our organizers then filled that vacant space with people. So one of the places I went to on Earth Day was to New York. I climbed up onto a platform that must have been 5 or 6 stories high, looked out over that sea of people, and sea is the right metaphor. There were people beyond the visual horizon. I couldn't see the end of the crowd. And I guess that was the first time that I realized that what we knew was going to be a big event was in fact going to be a massive, unprecedented event with the capacity to really be powerful.
Oh, how wonderful, how wonderful. I can imagine your feeling. Stephen, what Barbara just said, it really made me think about that when we talk about environmental movement, we are seeing some of the same excitement right now. I mean, people are aware of what is happening to our planet and the damage that we are doing to our environment. And there is a lot of people that are demanding action. Students are going to the streets. In September, we have 6 million students going to the streets to demand climate action. Do you feel that there is momentum like the one that you saw 50 years ago today?
Well, yes, what you're looking at on these screens are, we were the Greta Thunberg of our day, I suppose. And so Greta, Ghost of Christmas Future. But I think they've got, in some ways, a greater challenge than we did. To Denny's point, we got involved in this with really quite, I'd say, minimal expectations. There was no reason to believe it would be like trying today, this very day in 2020, to talk about climate in the middle of COVID. To Barbara's point, the war and the efforts of young people to bring the war to an end dominated the news. They were, the whole world was watching them. And then all of a sudden, we had this other message, and I have to say we're appropriately modest about what we thought we could accomplish. I think today, I think the expectations for the youth movement, the crisis they face is 50 years beyond what we were dealing with at the time. So I think they've got a much, I'd say, I don't know, Barbara, Denny, what you think, but I think they have a much greater challenge ahead of them than we did.
Oh, yes.
Unfortunately.
The difference between then and now is not just the internet and the computers or the social media or the cell phones. It's the climate of the political, the public policy climate compared to then. There was a significant bipartisan effort to focus on Earth Day and the subsequent adoption of all the key legislation. Certainly, there were leaders that we can point to that helped make it happen. But if it wasn't for some of the key Republicans in the Senate to support the Clean Air Act of 1970, with its very increased federal role in regulating air pollution, it would not have happened. And we don't have that today. We also have very different economic situation. With regard to not 50 years ago, we were still into the post-war boom. The middle class was growing. The economy was enabling the development of programs that, while might cost a little bit more for consumers, was reached with a consensus that in the long run, it would pay for itself with increased health, which it did. Today, we have a real decimation of the middle class in this country. We have folks in the top 1% making huge amounts, and a lot of folks not able to meet their daily needs. So it is a different situation, and it's much more difficult, I think, to reach consensus on issues.
Yes, it is much more challenging right now. And then when you look back at these 50 years, what happened? When and where did we go wrong? And we started to politicize the subject of climate?
Well, let me once again have two preparatory comments and then jump into your question directly. The first is that to give Barbara her due as our chief lobbyist on the Clean Air Act of 1970, it wasn't just that we had some bipartisan support and some Republicans were working closely with Democrats. In the end, it was passed by the United States Senate on a voice vote unanimously. It was passed by the House of Representatives with one dissenting vote out of 435 representatives. This was on a piece of legislation that was opposed by the coal industry, the oil industry, the electric utility industry, the automobile industry, and yet the support there, because of the outpouring of public concern for it, was such that Congress found it irresistible, and the president then, of course, signed it. Second, with regard to the challenges facing by the youth of today as opposed to us, probably the biggest difference is that we could pass laws in the United States and have them enforced by an environmental protection agency and by a Department of Justice that would address the problems that we were talking about. Today, it's all international. It just makes no difference whether a ton of coal is burned in Germany or China or the United States. Its climatic effects are exactly the same. And so we have to figure out a way, and these youth from around the world have had the good sense to make this an international set of climate strikes, that Homo sapiens will come together in a way that is much more difficult to achieve and really hasn't been achieved even on COVID, with imminent threats to public health, where we're prepared to defer to international authority. Then, geez, now I've forgotten what the actual question was you asked me.
We were talking about how right now climate change is an issue that is being politicized. It's not a human issue. They don't see it like that. And I think this is one of the greatest challenges, even here in the United States, to pass a bipartisan legislation like the one that Barbara, you helped pass. It seems really very difficult.
Some would say almost impossible without us having another public uprising. The seeds of that were really quite straightforward. In the 1960s, the Republican Party still had within it a great many progressive champions. I'd mentioned John Lindsay earlier, but John Chafee, and the first African-American senator elected since Reconstruction was Ed Brooke, a Republican out of Massachusetts who was a progressive. The co-chair of Earth Day, Pete McCloskey, a war hero who was an ardent anti-war activist and an environmentalist, were all card-carrying Republicans. In 1968, Richard Nixon began an effort to flip the solidly Democratic, racist South to the Republican Party, and that left, and he largely succeeded by the end of his second election. That drove a lot of the progressives out of the Republican Party, and it made the Democratic Party unfettered by the dominant committee chairman that had originally been coming from the South. So at that point, the polarization became more and more, and it's true just not on the environment, but on issue after issue. It's almost hard to get a Republican and a Democrat to agree that the sun will rise in the east tomorrow morning. The polarization is so great. And if Obama were to say that it's going to rise, then for sure Trump would say that it's not going to. It really has become ridiculous. But it is something that had its seeds back then, and the nature of the parties has simply changed since. And it's been true on climate.
Yes.
Final point on that is that there has been a massive disinformation campaign that took place over a couple of decades, paid for with billions of dollars from the fossil fuel industry. And it was mostly aligned with the Republican Party saying flat out lies about climate and saying that science should not be believed.
Yes, you are absolutely right. Stephen, you want to say?
But if I may say one thing, but Dennis, as you pointed out recently in a piece you wrote last week, we politicized the issue. I mean, I'm not sure that Barbara, and Barbara, I'm sure you would agree that it was the fact that, as we hope the youth leaders of today will do, we took it to November. We took it to the general public. We took it to elections, and we had to defeat anti-environmental members of Congress in order to get their attention and hit them with really a kind of political 2x4.
And the first person that was taken out was a Democrat, the chairman of the House Public Works Committee.
That's right.
Chairman of the Pork
Highway
Committee.
Trust Funds guy.
And I give him once again the credit to Steve. The concept of that Dirty Dozen campaign came from Steve, and with a trivial amount of money, less than $50,000, we took out 7 of 12 incumbent members of Congress on environmental issues. And at that point, we really got the attention. But again, it was a bipartisan effort. We took out Democrats and Republicans who were bad on the environment.
Great. Well, when you look back and 50 years ago, where we have advanced when we talk about environmental issues, and how do you see the movement today? I would like to start with Barbara.
You know, we really have had incredible progress. The dirty air that was in existence in 1970, the dirty water in our rivers and streams flowing through all of our major cities was terrible shape. And the federal laws that we adopted federalized the requirements to clean up our air and water, and it made a tremendous difference. We had an objective of reducing the pollution from automobiles by 90%. Well, that didn't happen in the deadline that we originally proposed. But the tremendous increase in the reduction of pollution from automobiles in this country is something that is well worth pointing to as progress. But what I think is happening now is an awareness, as Dennis correctly said, of the international implications of continuing to pour carbon emissions into our atmosphere. That is a focus that doesn't have any power to change, except country by country. And I'm looking back at what happened with the Clean Air Act. The reason we got the Clean Air Act enacted was that it imposed federal minimum standards on all the states, who individually, just like countries today, couldn't possibly regulate polluters in their own state, because those polluters would threaten to leave and go someplace else where it would be cheaper to make their pulp and paper, their automobiles, or their chemicals. So the feds had to step in, and that was the genius of those acts, is that they created a national minimum standard, which was very high compared to what was happening in the field at the time they were adopted. And we don't have the authority to do that at the international level. It's the source of a good deal of frustration, particularly when the United States is leading the way to doing nothing incrementally to help solve this problem.
Yes, absolutely. And the second polluter of all our planet. Dennis, what advice would you give today to environmentalists and the people that are concerned about the well-being of our planet?
Well, I think, as Steve suggested earlier, we were the students then, but nobody handed us a torch. I mean, we reached up and grabbed the torch. And I think it's time now for the next generation to answer that question. We're happy to consult with them. We're happy to try to pull out our generation, which now often has some people who are near retirement or past retirement, have some assets, have some time on their hands to form a gray-green alliance with the youth of today. But I suspect that as with virtually every movement, the anti-war movement, the civil rights movement, Tiananmen Square, the uprisings in Arab Spring, the current uprisings in Hong Kong, they are all led by youth.
Yes.
who are full of energy, full of idealism, and have not yet learned what it is impossible to do. And so they just go out and do it.
Yes, absolutely. Stephen, I was listening to a podcast this weekend, and the person that was talking said that everything great begins somewhere. Did you ever thought that this movement was going to be so big?
Oh, no, as I said, we started with fairly modest expectations, and but again, it comes back to the additional pressure, I think, that is on today's young people, because in fact, from the moment Greta Thunberg sat cross-legged with her sign that she drew at home, she was in the press and picked up by social media, and the expectations began to kick in. I would say one thing, Denny mentions our generation and the youth generation. There have been two generations, and people don't say enough about the parents of today's 15-year-olds, the sort of millennial parents. They did something quite remarkable that I don't think they ever got credit for. They brought recycling home. And these kids today who are on the streets grew up in homes that recycled because their parents brought that recycling message back from the schools. And I do think that they deserve more credit, the millennial generation, the parents of the Gretas, than they get, because I believe that what they accomplished specifically in and around recycling has been meaningful to the environment and was able to do something we maybe didn't do. We went to Washington, we raised a flag, but we didn't change people's behavior at home. Yes. What the millennials did with recycling is they brought it home. I think that's very important.
Yes, absolutely. And what we're seeing is that, we need from every part of our society. We need from you guys that are definitely an inspiration for the environmentalists of today. We need from the youth, we need from the corporations, we need from the governments. We need everybody to commit in order to overcome this crisis that we're facing. I truly thank you for all your contributions and everything that you have done. It's been wonderful to talk to you, and I wish you a wonderful Earth Day. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you.